The Clemson Tigers are without a doubt the class of the ACC, and they have moved themselves into a position where they occupy that space in a way that Ohio State does in the Big Ten and Oklahoma does in the Big 12. That anytime we talk about the ACC and what's going to happen on the football field, your number one stop has to be in the upstate with Dabo Swinney and this Clemson Tigers team that has rolled off 6 consecutive ACC championships. Now, the season didn't end the way they had hoped, as they did end up getting lit up by Justin Fields and the Ohio State offense. Trevor Lawrence didn't have an awful game, but frustrating as it marks his second straight season that ends in New Orleans in the Superdome with a loss to a blue blood, obviously the other one being in the national championship game against LSU. So as the Clemson Tigers say goodbye to Trevor Lawrence, they say goodbye to 2-time ACC Player of the Year Travis Etienne. We enter the DJ Uiagalelei era. We've got a group of young wide receivers that, we've mentioned several times on here, didn't quite develop or had injury issues such that, we had like Cornell Powell's gone, Amari Rodgers, Travis Etienne, Trevor Lawrence. We're rebuilding things. Defensive side of the ball, totally different. If Mike Jones Jr. had stayed instead of transferring to LSU, we'd have every single starter back, but we've also said goodbye to Darion Kendrick, but it is a loaded group, especially up front with a lot of those young players, Brian Brzee, Miles Murphy, now a year older. So we have a game against Georgia on the schedule. And then, of course, the pursuit of another ACC championship and a college football playoff, of course, being impacted by the result of that game against the Bulldogs. With it being Clemson, I wanted to start with, where are you concerned?
Can I say that I'm not?
Yes, I think that's an answer.
I'm not all that concerned. It's strange because there's an aspect to it where, clearly Trevor Lawrence is gone. One of the best quarterbacks in the country for the last years, if not the best, going to be the number one pick in the draft. And typically when you'd see that, they'd be like, all right, well, cool. We got like a QB kind of battle to pay attention to going into the spring. That's going to be interesting for this team, but we already know who the QB is going to be. So that takes it out of it. So now it's like, okay, Travis Etienne's gone. All right. Well, how are they going to replace him? Well, they'll probably replace him with the guy who's been his backup the last few years. Oh, and there's a 5-star freshman coming in who's already enrolled. So maybe he'll get some, time there. So there's really nothing to worry about there. Defensively, I think what was on Connolly's returning production rankings, their defense ranks what? Third, yeah, as far as like production coming back. So, all right, everybody's back on defense. And while they're way down on offense, that's because of Trevor Lawrence and Etienne, but they'll replace both of them. So, like, my only real concern about Clemson, and I don't know that it's a concern is just receivers. Somebody needs to step up and be the guy, because as we've spent so much time talking about on this podcast over the last season, receivers are becoming more and more important. And that felt like the one area where Clemson was deficient in comparison to the other college football playoff contenders last season.
Chip, this is a pattern with me, because I think you've noticed I'm too patient with head coaches, right? You called me out that a couple times. You're like, you'd never fire anybody. I have another similar kind of character trait that I get concerned with new quarterbacks. And I know DJ looked awesome when he played, and against Notre Dame on the biggest stage out there, didn't miss a beat, over 400 yards passing, looked like he was totally calm in the moment. Like, everything looked great. I don't know. Like, there's a part of me that wants to see young quarterbacks struggle. And how do you respond after that struggle? That's one of the reasons I was really bullish on Mac Jones at Alabama going into this season, was because he threw 2 pick sixes against Auburn in a loss the year before, but it didn't rattle him. Like, he kept coming back and I think he ended up throwing for 400 yards in that game. And he was not phased at all. I want to see how a quarterback does. What happens if DJ goes out and has a rough game against Georgia, which is not crazy to think that could happen. How does he respond to that? But in saying that, I'm not worried about Clemson winning the ACC. To me, it's kind of like what we saw with Spencer Rattler last year with Oklahoma. Struggled early. They took their lumps, and then they end up winning the Big 12, but it's just enough to have them miss the playoffs. I wonder if DJ has some learning curve type of game where it's a fourth quarter, like exactly what you saw with Spencer Rattler, trying to squeeze balls into tight windows where they're open all the time, usually in practice or in high school, but then all of a sudden they're gone and it's an interception, you lose. And then that criticism starts coming your way. And then it's, well, man, we missed Trevor Lawrence and Deshaun Watson, and is DJ that good? Those types of criticisms come in, and how does it impact your play? So, yeah, I think he's going to be great. I think he's going to be awesome, but I don't, there's always that sliver of doubt in me that says, I don't know. Like, maybe how does he respond?
Is that a traditionalist move? Like, I want to see, like I want to see guys grow. I don't want to see these guys come in here and just hit the ground running. I like it. Yeah, and then listen, and you will have a great, a lot of space to yourself if you want to take up a fade DJU position.
I don't want it to be that. I don't want to be like, it's not going to be my
all you, baby.
It's not going to be my Colin Cowherd, Baker Mayfield, like vendetta. Like, I'm not going to have that. I'm just concerned. Like, I think he's going to be awesome. He probably is going to be a number one overall pick, but for what it means Clemson specifically and what their goal is to win a national championship, I'm not christening DJ as the national championship winning quarterback just yet.
Okay, but if Danny wants to squeeze DJU, I'm ready to just like absolutely like squeeze that short, dude. Let's AMC that thing.
I got a proposition though. If DJU tweets about seeing a UFO, can Danny then start talking about how?
Yes, my quarterback wouldn't do that. I never did that when I was a quarterback in big time college football. We can make it.
Oh man, I think I'm kind of there with Tom. I really don't have many concerns. This was already a really good football team last year. The defense just couldn't get to that level, I think, where it needed to match up with what Trevor had, and Trevor was trying to carry that offense with your receivers that didn't really scare anybody. I mean, Cornell Powell had a nice year, but like that unit was supposed to be Justin Ross, and then he hurts his neck, right?
Who, by the way,
misses the whole year.
Back.
Mm-hmm.
Back, and apparently back like healthy enough to where Dabo's talking about him being the punt returner.
Yeah.
So like he might be like back and like real healthy and ready to go.
And I like EJ Williams too. I mean, as soon as I was, sitting there talking, I thought that as a freshman, EJ Williams had a good like couple games right near the end of the year where he was flashing in a way where I could see him being a bigger factor throughout the entire season.
No doubt. And they've stepped up their recruiting in the last couple of years. I think the chance you get either one of Joe Nagata or Frank Ladson to take a step is pretty high. And so that should help solve some of their issues on offense, which were lack of explosive plays through the air. They just didn't get the ball down the field on big plays like they used to. On defense, they had the exact opposite problem. They allowed a ton of bombs, and I think part of it was they had to blitz too much. Like the guys they had up front were either too young or too injured. But I mean, you think about it, like Tyler Davis and X-Man and KJ Henry and Brzee and Murphy, all those guys are a year older. They're all back. I think the chance that they don't have a dominant defensive front is very low. And I think everybody in the secondary, including Andrew Booth, who's already awesome, will look even better for having that pass rush, and they won't have to blitz quite as much.
Question for you, Bud, because like I mentioned, they've got Will Shipley, who's a 5-star coming in at running back, who I would be surprised to see if he gets any snaps this fall because he is enrolled early, but just at the wide receiver position, because they've got 2 4-stars that are enrolled early. There's Bo Collins out of California and Dakari Collins. So the Collins guys, will either of them, do you consider either of them to be the level to where they could make an impact as freshmen this year?
Not really, but Shipley, I think will play because he catches the ball well. We have APB, which is all-purpose back next to his name. I think he will get some run for sure, and he catches the ball, really well. One of the guys that I have heard who might have some potential there to play early is Alou Ba, who is a dude. I believe he's actually Canadian, who came down to Clearwater and was somebody that Clemson was pretty high on. He was in the 20. Was he a 20 kid? Trying like some of these years from prior years blend together for me now. But yeah. So not Alou Ba, excuse me. Ajo, dude out of Clearwater. Yeah.
That dude is outrageous.
He's pretty freaky. If he takes a step, that's going to be fun to watch.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. All right. The Florida State Seminoles are going to be trotting out transfer portal all-stars, baby. And it's probably starting at the quarterback position as we're watching Mackenzie Milton. One of the biggest stories in all of spring practice is going to be Mackenzie Milton, the football player, human being, making his return to really high-level competition, and B, seeing if he can provide a real difference-making option at the quarterback position, a position that has not been good for Florida State in recent years. Even though when we start to look elsewhere on Florida State's roster, there's a handful, maybe even half dozen other important transfers. We talked about Florida State a lot as we wrapped up the winners and losers of the transfer portal and how Mike Norvell is using that as a way to really address some issues. Now, there's also a little bit of a growing buzz, and Bud, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of around the tide turning maybe on the 2022 cycle. And I would say that if you want to talk yourself into the idea that Florida State, it's not going to be back, but at least seems to have things going in the right direction. Maybe it'll just be like a win. Maybe it'll be a couple of wins. There could be some moments where you start to really talk yourself into the Seminoles. Now, I am saying all this with a couple Noles here on the podcast, so very curious to see if you've been sensing some of that same optimism. But as I started to dig around, I found myself allowing the idea that Florida State was going to be a pretty competitive team in 2021. And in the big picture, one of the most interesting stories in college football, if they can start to take multiple steps in the positive direction, not just like one step forward, two steps back.
So I guess to start with the recruiting thing, yeah, they definitely have momentum on the trail. They've done a nice job scouting. And they got some early commits from some really good players. They got extremely lucky in that the guy who is the best non-quarterback recruit in the entire country, Travis Hunter, who is pretty clearly like the best receiver and the best DB recruit in the whole nation, grew up a huge Florida State fan. His grandma loves Florida State. He's from Palm Beach. He's like, I don't care if they win one game, I'm going to Florida State. And he's probably their best recruiter too. It's just not that often that you get a guy who is like that personable and that talented, who grew up a mega fan of your school. I mean, Derwin James is probably the last dude I could think of. And I think Travis is a little more vocal as far as leading the charge. So you need a bell cow like that to sort of pitch your message that, hey, yeah, they won 3 games last year, but this is going to turn around. So pretty nice timing there. They're also in it for Marvin Jones Jr., who you may recall the name Marvin Jones.
Yeah,
obviously. And if they can get him out of Heritage, then they would really be rocking and rolling there. But they got to win some games first, potentially. There's certain kids who do care how many games they win. And so for this spring, I mean, to me, on offense, it's all about the passing game. Last year, their passing game, it sucked, right? Especially on downs when you knew they had to throw the ball. They did a really nice job with play action. Jordan Travis scrambled around a whole lot. The receivers are nothing special. I still think they're kind of crappy. Running back, I don't think they have any real difference makers at running back. Milton should help some. We'll see how much they can integrate in the offense. And the offensive line, again, when they had to drop back and pass and it wasn't off play action, they were bad. They kind of smoke and mirrors their way to points last year. And it says something that the offense was the better side of the ball.
Mm-hmm. Remember the North Carolina game? They kind of rolled out Jordan Travis running the football and play action with him. And it really opened some things. And they had this massive upset. But then
top 5 win, baby.
Right. Top 5 win. But then once people saw that element of the pass game, they just quickly adjusted and kind of exposed Jordan Travis of more of a runner, and his deficiencies in the pass game really became evident. And then it was kind of back to square one where, man, just give me Mackenzie Milton starting for 12 games, which would be a huge win. Give me some consistent play where I don't think you have to recreate the Heisman candidate Mackenzie Milton. If you could, that'd be the best case scenario, but give me some stability. Give me a guy that you can count on to give you 65% completions, who's not going to throw a boneheaded interception at the wrong time or take a sack when he could throw it away, or just the repeated mistakes you've seen at quarterback. Let's eliminate those. And I think that puts you in 2 to 3 more games that you had no chance winning this past year or two, but all of a sudden you have a chance in the fourth quarter. That kind of momentum can carry. And then maybe you get one of those games to swing your way. Trust me, I am on the Mike Norvell train after hearing him speak in person. I was ready to run through a wall for him, right? So I am fresh off of that message. I do think the further you are removed from some of Jimbo's players, from some of Willie Taggart's players, that you're starting to see, hopefully for Mike Norvell, a shift in mindset just from a from a cultural, inside that locker room, when all of a sudden they're down, or either way, they're either winning by 2 touchdowns at the half and they implode and they totally panic and lose the game, which we saw a number of times the last couple of years, or they go down, they start yelling at each other, pointing fingers. Like, those types of games need to stop happening. They need to learn to close out, and they need to learn how to work their way through adversity. But I do think, like, Mike Norvell is preaching those types of things. I think bringing in a veteran at quarterback, bringing in a lot of veterans who have been through ups and downs of college football, have been in games where they've been down and they've come back. And I think that type of experience and that type of leadership, which is what you get when you go through the transfer portal, could be really valuable. Now, the question is, like, what is a good season? Because I get asked this all the time, like, hey, what should you expect this year? You start off with Notre Dame, like, at home, in a year when everyone's going to be, yes, Mackenzie Milton's our guy. Like, I don't think they're going to win that game. Do you, Bud? Like, would you pick them to win that game?
Danny, I don't think they can block Notre Dame.
Right.
No, like, I think 6-6 is a good year for them. If they make it back to a bowl legitimately, I think is a good year. People don't want to hear that, but, like, we're going to talk more on this podcast. Guys, Wake Forest, NC State bring back a ton. You're going to be underdogs in those games.
Yeah.
Like, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, that's like,
and then, like, how do you get that like the mentality in the locker room? How do you keep encouraging? How do you gain momentum off of 6-6? It's a tough job to do.
If you get a 6-6, you can say that you doubled your win total.
Yeah. I think that's a key thing. I think that the mindset of this team is something that's worth keeping an eye on. And I think it's really important. And obviously, Milton McKenzie is going to be important, and that's kind of the headline. But for me, if I'm watching Florida State this spring, the thing I'm probably focusing on more than anything is the line play on both the offensive and defensive side, because the offensive line struggles have been well documented for the last few years. It has not been good. But even last year, like Bud, you were talking about, that defensive front was not very good. They finished in tackles for loss per game. They finished 14th of the 15 teams in the ACC last year, when we were including Notre Dame. There just wasn't a lot of disruption and pressure from that front seven, which made it more difficult for the defense as a whole. So I feel like it's going to be really hard for Florida State, even with McKenzie and a bunch of other transfers at other places. It's going to be difficult for them to take a significant step forward if we don't see significant improvement on both sides of the offensive and defensive lines going forward. So for me this spring, I think that should be an area of focus for them. And if I'm watching to try to figure out what it's going to be, that would be an area of focus, because it's like you mentioned, like the record for this year, like 6-6 would be good. And that Notre Dame game is not the only tough game on the schedule. This is a team that is going on the road for North Carolina, Clemson, and Florida. None of those are at home. It's a brutal schedule in 2021.
And North Carolina.
Hey,
yeah, right.
Mac Brown's never beaten Florida State. Never beaten his alma mater.
I will say, I do think that there is room for significant improvement. And normally you wouldn't say that, like, hey, getting guys who are competent, accomplished SEC players off rosters whose coaches got fired, right? It would be a big deal. But the thing is, a return to competency on defense for a defense that was 85th in Connolly's defensive rating last year, if you can get to like 45th, that's a huge jump. Mm-hmm. I think that's actually doable, right? Like that's their path to a bowl game, maybe a bowl game plus another win or two. Like that's how they get there, is with McKenzie Milton on offense. Having seen what they worked with last year, and that they were able to score points a lot more than I thought they could, I'm pretty bought in on what Mike Norvell can do offensively. I think he's a very good schemer. He finds ways to get points on the board. Defensively, they didn't look very well coordinated last year. They didn't play together. They didn't get a lot of pressure up front, like you said. And they went out and they got, they take five transfers on defense who were SEC starters. They're not studs, but I think probably at least 4 of those dudes are going to start. And that should help them get back to like an average defense, I think.
Well, you mentioned the NC State Wolfpack. They are up next, coming off an 8-4 season. You look up and Dave Doran has won 8+ games 3 times in the last 4 years. And this year he did it with his starter initially, Devin Leary, not starting the beginning of the season because NC State had a lot of COVID issues and they had a lot of players out. They had to shut the program down. So Devin Leary needed some time before he had his legs under him at the beginning of the season. He does take over as the starter, playing really, really well, gets injured. Bailey Hockman has to come back in for NC State. So that that made things challenging, but still they found ways to be able to persevere and overcome. I wonder if Dave Doeren, because remember, this NC State team was toe-to-toe with Miami on like a Thursday or Friday night playing in Raleigh. Game ended up being like a 44-41 shootout or something like that. They really probably should have beaten Kentucky in the bowl game. This could have been a 9-3. This could have been a 10-2 kind of season for NC State. And it felt like it didn't come with a whole lot of buzz. They crept up into the top 25 near the end of the season, I guess only to fall out after the bowl game. And so I wonder, as we do, like you mentioned, lots of starters back on both sides of the ball. Devin Leary, if he's fully healthy, should be easily a top half of the ACC kind of quarterback and a real difference maker for the offense. Defensively, you lose Aleem McNeil, but I think Daniel Joseph is an exciting player on that defensive line that I always turn back to. Is Dave Doeren underrated?
Yes. Just look at the production that he's had at this job. I mean, he took over 3-9 his first season, then 8 wins, 2 7 wins. Then they kind of peaked at the 9-win seasons. And then they had that 4-8 year where you're kind of like, okay, well, there's one of those situations you see it all the time. Things come together at the right time. You get a veteran roster, you put together good seasons, and then that class leaves and things bottom out and you're not sure where it's going. And then they rebound last year with an 8-4 season where they looked really good and they looked like one of the better teams in the ACC. And of course, the thing about the 2020 season that we'll always have to try to figure out, we'll never really be sure of, is had it been a normal season with a normal schedule, would things have played out the same way? We don't know. All we know is that NC State went 8-4, and this is a team that on an annual basis is maybe not, competing for ACC titles, but is pretty solidly in that, tier 2 of ACC teams that is capable of beating just about anybody any given week, and is one of the better teams in the conference, but it's kind of continuously overlooked.
I absolutely think he's underrated. I think a lot of it has to do with his personality. Like, it's dull, like it's just, he's kind of boring, like go to work, get my job done. But if he was out, tweeting memes like Mike Leach or Lane Kiffin, we would be talking a lot more about him and a lot more about his success. He also, the fact that he plays in the Atlantic, it's kind of, you get lost in the shuffle. If you played in the Coastal and had like a signature ACC championship game appearance, I think we would perceive him differently. Where you look at his run of records, that would have been good enough in the other division. But because he's lacking that, because Clemson has dominated this side, it's just, he kind of gets overlooked. After the 4-8 season, I think fans fall victim to that too. Fans look at
he was on the hot seat going into last season.
That's what I'm saying. But I think that's because like fans get bored. Like, our coach he's not fun. He doesn't come get the right, I think fans fall victim to that. They get a little bit spoiled and they look around and say, we want a coach with a personality instead of a coach with a consistent winning record.
I think he does. I agree that he's underrated, and it sounds like, Bud, you'll at least be able to present the other side of this on the Dave Doeren judgment. But I give him credit for the program building, and so there's a lot of like key strength and conditioning coach D'Antonio Burnett, former NC State player who's really committed himself, and we've seen the way like Aleem McNeil was not supposed to be an NFL draft pick. The guy comes out of Sanderson and ends up developing into one of the best defensive linemen in the entire ACC. There's just offensive line, defensive line. It seems that they've really built out a consistency in the way that they teach the players, the way that they develop them physically. And the NFL picks that have been coming out of Raleigh suggest that the infrastructure is good, and I give Dave Doeren a lot of credit for that. Some of that might just be making the right hires. Some of that might be just, letting people do what they're good at. But there just seems to be, like, I think some people like working for Dave Doeren because he's not difficult to pin down, right? Like, exactly what you're going to get. I can't speak to that. I would need to speak to more NC State assistants. I know some people don't like him, but most people who get fired don't have nice things to say. But I don't know. Anyway, Bud, where are you at with Dave Doeren?
I think he's fine. Like, I really don't think he's underrated. I think NC State has good resources. I think you can do a decent job winning there. They were 4-8 the prior year. Last year, he got an absolute gift of a schedule. I mean, if you recall, like, their schedule was set not to be that easy, and then it became super easy. I mean, Wake, VT, and that was back when the Hokies had a bunch of COVID stuff, then they still get blown out by 3 touchdowns.
They beat Virginia and Liberty though.
Yeah, Pitt, Virginia, Duke, one of the worst Duke teams in a while. UNC, they get blown out by 4 scores. Miami, they lose. Florida State, they blow them out. Liberty, 1-point win at Syracuse, 1 touchdown win over a really bad Syracuse team. Georgia Tech, which kind of cratered, but at the end of the year, they beat them by 10. 2-score loss to Kentucky in the bowl game. I don't know. I think the advanced numbers have this thing right from last year, guys.
S&P or
this was not that impressive of a team. It had a good record, but so I'll say this: I'm actually in on this team this year.
But
I think last year's team was a hoax. Isn't
that a good thing though? If he has a team that's average with the advanced analytics, but he gets to 8 wins, isn't that a good thing?
Not if it's not repeatable. It's just luck.
Well, I guess we'll find out this year.
Right. I'm in on this year's team though. Okay. First of all, I really like Devin Leary. I got to see him at Elite 11 a couple years ago. He's got a big time arm. I think he's a very good player. And I was talking to Corey Smith of Pack Pride on the 24/7 Sports Network, and he was telling me, look, Leary only got 3 spring practices last year, and he missed almost all of fall with COVID. So he came in there and balled out, despite the fact he had almost no time in Tim Beck's new offense. He had to learn it all, basically virtually. You get 10 starters back on offense. You get 10 starters back on defense. I really like this Josh Harris kid they have. I've heard he's getting in better shape at D tackle to replace Aleem McNeil. He wrecked it in the Army All-American Combine we had a couple years ago in Alamo Dome, and I spent a couple minutes trying to figure out who the hell he was because his jersey got ripped off because they were having to hold him so bad. He's a pretty good player. I think this team could be a whole lot better in terms of quality of play, and also have the same record as last year's team. Because this schedule is much tougher, and I think this year's team would beat the hell out of last year's team. It might end up with the same record.
Right. I can feel that. I am also excited about this NC State team. I am curious. I am not excited, but I'm curious to see how things go for Scott Satterfield at Louisville, because you just cannot undo the apology letter about the South Carolina job and the explanation, which was, we discussed here on the Cover 3 podcast. On one hand, I appreciate that he is trying to, be honest about his desire to be close to family. But on the other, man, it did not seem to play well with the fan base. And, I try to not allow my definition of the fan base to be what I see on sports radio or hear on sports radio or see on Twitter. I try to understand that, especially at a program like Louisville that is so tied into that community, the fan base can include, can include more level-minded analysis. And Scott Satterfield did a fantastic job in year 1. But after going 4-7, falling well short of expectations, an offense that on paper was going to be really, really good. Now all of a sudden, you've got a couple coaching moves. You've got a couple of departures, including Tutu Atwell. Malik Cunningham is back, but again, you're not fired up about saying Malik Cunningham is back like you were a year ago. So I am intrigued about Louisville and all the spring practice ongoings and the media availabilities through the lens of the Scott Satterfield stock price. How about that in the eyes of the Louisville fan base? Am I just way too caught up in the drama here?
No, I think the first month or so of the season will probably be huge for Louisville. So I think that this spring is very important for them. And I agree with you. They lose Tutu Atwell. They lost Javian Hawkins. Malik Cunningham is back, although they have had a couple of transfer quarterbacks come in Shai Wertz and Luke McCaffrey. Although Wertz, it sounds like he's going to be Tutu Atwell's replacement in the slot for the most part. Not sure what Luke McCaffrey's role is, if he's just there to provide competition and maybe earn the starting job, or if he's just depth at the position or what. But just looking at what they have going into next year as far as the schedule, because you mentioned the Satterfield stuff, the kind of the fan base kind of not really taking that very well, and understandably so. They open the year with Ole Miss, then they get an Eastern Kentucky bye game, but then they got UCF, at Florida State, at Wake, and Virginia. That's a pretty, there's some landmines there. And if Louisville gets off to a slow start, considering everything that happened with the South Carolina job and the way that was handled, it might be really difficult for Satterfield to find solid footing again going forward with the program. So it's going to be interesting. So I think this is a very important spring for a team that lost a lot on defense, has to replace a lot of its production, is losing a lot of production on offense, and has a lot of question marks. So I don't think there's really one area in particular that I think you need to focus on. I think there's a lot of things that Louisville needs to figure out this spring and over the summer going into the season.
I kind of think that, Chip, you are overreacting a little bit. Just looking at like the quality of play, the stuff we can actually measure, they were extremely lucky in 19, right? Like they should not have had that record. And then last year they were very unlucky as far as how the ball bounced for them. In fact, I mean, if you look at like the Vegas power rating stuff, 2020 Louisville is a decent bit better than 2019 Louisville, but the record didn't show that. The thing is, if you want to be successful as a head coach, you do kind of have to time, like, you gotta catch it right. Okay. And there's a narrative that forms, hey, they're really good year one and they regressed in year two. I don't think they regressed. I think their record regressed. I don't think they actually were that much worse. They played a tougher schedule and they didn't get the bounces that they would normally get. They had some games that didn't go their way necessarily, but also they have a lot of firepower to replace, man, a whole lot. And that scares me a little bit. Like, did they waste a really good potential team last year on a year where they didn't get bounces? They had some tough breaks, and now they got Atwell, Des Fitzpatrick, Javian Hawkins, all those dudes are gone. I worry about their explosiveness on offense some, and yet I do think Satterfield's a pretty good coach.
0-4 games decided by 7 points or less. They did play Notre Dame 12-7. Like, it was one of Notre Dame's ugliest games. It was disgusting.
And that was the game where like Notre Dame was like, Notre Dame was like 0 for 4 in the red zone. Yeah. So that wasn't really a 5-point game.
No. All 5 offensive linemen back. It's good news up front. But how crazy is it, though, that would anybody have guessed after 8-5 year one that 1 year later Scott Satterfield would be in the hot seat? Now, granted, a lot of that's because of the way he handled the coaching interview process. But I do think he's on the hot seat. And I do think I agree with Tom. Like, the way this season starts off, because I bet that trust, that bond between him and his players is really like kind of teetering right there. And if you start off with a couple wins, you kind of, it's, oh yeah, that's our guy. He committed to us, we're back. Like, and you get that kind of feel good mojo going. But if you don't, oh man, if you start off rough, then those players are going to, man, this coach was about to leave us, like it's the fickle nature of not only the fans, but the players in that locker room too.
One of the best first-year coaching jobs for my money was Jeff Hafley. He got Boston College to 6-5. We got to see, Phil Dracovic, and his connection with Zay Flowers was absolutely fantastic. Flowers goes for 1,000 yards. And guess what? They're both back. So Boston College exceeded expectations in year one. Bud, to shout out narratives that do get formed. Do you think that was a true judge of sort of where Boston College was, level of play? And are you expecting there to be any kind of linear trajectory, or is a winning record like 7-5? Is that sort of where we should peg Boston College for the time being?
That's kind of about where I would probably expect them to be. So I talked to Tyler Calvaruso at Eagle Insider, and he was like, look, they bring back quite a bit, and they should probably take a step forward. Now, David Bailey, the running back, was really good for them last year, and they don't have like a clear dude. Like at Clemson, it's pretty clear. Jalen Dixon, unless somebody else really emerges, is probably going to take over for Etienne. But like at BC, they got a bunch of names. I don't know if they have the dude who's like the guy for sure. And one of them is, West Virginia transfer Alex Sinkfield. We'll see. We'll see how well he's able to factor in. Defensively, I think this is where they could show some serious improvement. I know Jeff Hadley's a defensive coach, but they were bad on defense last year, guys. Yeah. And they were 98th in the country in defense. That's poor. They didn't really feel like they had a chance to get their install in spring, and that's a common theme. Like NC State feels the same way. Boston College, a lot of these teams that had new coordinators didn't get their install in. They do lose Isaiah McDuffie and Max Richardson in the middle of the defense. That's kind of a problem. The what?
I was just saying significant.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But like they bring in some transfers, maybe true freshman Bryce Steele can carve out a role there for spring practice. But I think if they're able to take a step forward, it's because they're able to be solid on offense again and the defense takes a step forward due to continuity, better understanding of the scheme, that type of stuff.
I also think their defense would be helped out if they could run the ball better, because like they were pretty one-dimensional on offense last year. And I think that if you're able to at least not be like a top tier rushing team, but they averaged like 3.1 yards per carry, just help balance things out a little bit.
They were bizarro Boston College last year. Like they were exactly the opposite of what they've been, because they've been average to below average quarterback play with some of the best running backs in the country, and they played really tough physical defense.
Yeah, just roll through all ACC running backs.
Yeah, so now we've given the exact opposite of what they were last year. Their quarterback was awesome, showed some really bright signs of potential. They were 118th in rushing in the country, and their defense couldn't get off the field. So somewhere in there's a balance, but I do think Phil Jurkovec was a bright sign of this offense, and because he's coming back with an entire offensive line, I feel like they'll get the offensive line, the run game going. And I like Jeff Hafley. I think he's the right guy for the job. And I think I wouldn't be surprised in another 2 years if BC fans are worried about losing Jeff Hafley.
I agree with that. You got anything else on BC? I was going to go to Wake next. Wake Forest sleeper team in ACC 2021. Tell me I'm wrong. This team is going to be old. It's already a program that comes in and like wants you to redshirt, has a bunch of redshirt juniors, redshirt seniors, get old and stay old. Well, they're going to have 23, 24-year-olds. It's going to be just a bunch of like former minor league baseball players out there where you just have bizarro ages. I think that is like the extra year of eligibility, and sort of the way that this Wake Forest program is built is made to be able to hit the ground running. I'm excited about what this team can do. Sam Hartman is back. Sam Hartman, who he threw only one interception in the entire regular season. He threw 4 interceptions in 12 snaps against Wisconsin in the bowl game. I don't know. It was weird, bad day, but Sam Hartman's back. They have a ton of experience, and it's worth going back and sort of looking at how disjointed the season was for the Demon Deacons, because there was a stretch in the middle of the year where they were playing some of the best ball in the ACC outside of Clemson. So Wake Forest sleeper in 2021. Tell me I'm wrong.
I'm not going to tell you you're wrong. I think that we've reached the point with Dave Clawson's program that you just expect a certain level of competency. And I think we're probably going to see that certain level of competency where this is a Wake Forest team that's probably going to go to a bowl game. It's probably going to play some teams that we feel like it shouldn't play that well against better than we think. And it might have a couple bad games here and there, but it's not going to get blown out very often. It's going to be in the running. It's probably going to score a lot of points. The question is going to be, how often are they able to stop the other team from scoring points? We're probably going to take some overs. It's probably going to be a good time, and we should probably just kind of sit back and enjoy the ride.
I think they're like, I'll buy them as a sleeper in terms of everybody will just put them at the bottom of the division because that's kind of what happens every year. And I think they're probably a little bit closer to the middle of the division. I don't think they're going to challenge Clemson. I don't think they're going to have a real chance to finish second in the division or like that, but they do return a ton of experience. I mean, they got to replace Boogie Basham, which is a big deal because he was a stud for them on defense. Can Hartman take the next step, which you might have to because their run game was still kind of iffy. They got wrecked with injuries at safety last year. So I'm interested to see who's actually their starters at safety. Who's going to step up and be the guy? Because last year it was just a rotating cast of injury.
The wide receiver position also got Sage Strat opted out, but even then they started losing players to injury left and right, and they still had playmakers. I got to go in. I don't have the wide receiver coach or pass game coordinator on top of mind for Wake Forest, but that is a position where I feel like they've done a good job of prioritizing as they have slowly moved to this sort of up-tempo attack to be able to have just player after player that's going to be good at wide receiver in that system.
Yeah, Jakari Roberson has been well. I think they've just done a good job of identifying what they want and what they look for at that spot, and they keep finding it and plugging it in and getting good results.
All right. Danny, you got anything on Wake?
Third or fourth best team in the Atlantic. When you say surprise, were you saying they could be the second best team?
Yes. I don't feel confident saying that Florida State, Boston College, or Louisville or NC State are definitively better or will finish with a better conference record than Wake Forest.
Does the second place team in the ACC or ACC Atlantic have two or more than two conference losses?
Yes.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think second place is 5-3. It's Louisville. Yeah. It's Louisville finishing solo second 2 years ago in Scott Satterfield's first year, but they did it with a 5-3 record and, kind of some fortunate bounces along the way. I think that pile of teams below Clemson is quality. Like I think that they're all bowl teams, but who finishes on top is probably going to be very, very narrow margins. Finally, is it going to be too lazy just to put Syracuse number 7?
No.
Filling out the okay.
I mean,
nope.
What's Syracuse known for? Like Dino Babers, like when they had their 10-win season, it was putting up points, a really prolific offense. Like last year, their offense was just awful. And there's a chance that it'll improve and things will improve, because you got to remember, like going into the year, they had players opting out, then they were dealing with injuries, and they were really a shell of a football team for most of the season. So it's hard to know how much of that was where the team stands or the circumstances it was in. So there is reason to be optimistic about it if you're hoping that it was just kind of the circumstances that they had to deal with and they didn't do a good job dealing with them. Now we're starting a new year, get spring practice, everything's going to be better. Maybe. But I just don't know what I saw last year from that team that could have me coming into 2021 feeling very optimistic about what's going to happen.
I talked to Stephen Bailey at Cuse Nation, and he gave me a little bit of reason for hope, but also raised some more questions I hadn't even thought of, which is not great because they're already the worst team in the league. So last year they did put in a brand new 3-3-5 defense, and they only had 3 days to do it in spring practice. And if you guys recall, the first couple games, it actually kind of worked. It had UNC befuddled for probably about 3 quarters. Pitt had a little trouble with it. Georgia Tech had a little trouble with it. And then I think teams realized, wait a second, is this all they run? Because they only had very limited time to install their stuff. They didn't have any counter punches. So then teams were like, yeah, this is what Syracuse runs. That Duke team puts up 38. Liberty puts up 38. Clemson 47. Wake Forest 38. Notre Dame 45. NC State 36. Louisville 30. Basically, they didn't have anything else. They did discover Michael Jones, who's a stud at linebacker. And I feel like every nice thing I say about Syracuse, they have a negative. It's like Lee Pogba is still suspended, and we have no idea if he's going to be just off the team or not. They also lose Cisco and some other important dudes in the secondary, and their defense was the best side of the ball last year. So they'll be
better.
I think they
were young and tiny, and at one point, remember we said they got the FCS line for Clemson because they were fielding an FCS team. They had 60 scholarship players dressed out, and 30 of them were underclassmen. They were young and experienced and tiny. So
and they had to practice in a state which was one of the more stricter COVID protocols out there. Probably had less time on the field with their players than any other team in the ACC, and maybe fewer than anybody in the country.
That's a good point. So
O-line might be better. That's the one thing that's been really, really bad for them. And they do have some young guys they're fairly excited about who they think this is the year they'll take a step. Running back, they get Adams and Howard both came back.
That's good.
So that's pretty loaded in the backfield.
And DeVito is back. He suffered that season-ending injury 3 or 4 weeks into the season. So, all the promise of Jim Tan Laundry in all of his glory, being able to get out there and ball.
And I think he beats out Schrader, by the way. So remember Garrett Schrader from Mississippi State
transfer.
Yeah, they brought him in. I think DeVito wins that.
I just want the dome to be electric.
That's all we want. We'll have the Dino drop on here again. I
hope it's not for the Dino's been fired episode.
Yeah, I know. I feel it. I feel it in my bones. We can do it. You can follow him on Twitter at Bud Elliott 3. You can follow him at Tom Fernell. You can follow him at Danny Cannell. You can follow me at Chip_Patterson. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
See ya.